Welcome, everyone, to You Have Permission, the show that aims to take both Christianity and the modern world of science and culture very seriously. My name's Dan Koch. I'm a licensed therapist. For today's purposes, I'm also a former professional musician, and I'm a post-evangelical liberal Protestant trying to hang on to the best and let go of the rest. Elias, was that good enough for like a megachurch stage?
Oh, man. I mean, I run a marketing agency. I'd hire you on the spot. That was great.
I'm still not sure if I like that catchphrase. I feel like I need to find like the more you know, like sound to play after it.
Yes.
Little wink and nod. But that's kind of what we're doing here on this show. And today I am joined by Elias Dummer, solo worship artist, formerly of the Canadian Christian rock band, the City Harmonic. And I do kind of want to start there with you. I listened to City Harmonic's top song, Manifesto, this morning. And I was honestly a little surprised, no offense, to genuinely like it and add it to some of my playlists. It's obviously, like it's really well produced. Like it's a really good sounding recording. Your band sounds great. Your voice sounds great.
Thanks.
But actually the thing that I appreciated most was the skill it takes to take existing texts like the Nicene Creed and the Lord's Prayer and that song and put it into a pop music structure. I have a lot of experience trying that out in an old band I was in called Pacific Gold. In my opinion, I don't think I did the lyrical textual thing with very much success. I think you really did with that song. So we'll probably play that song like maybe as we say goodbye, like that song will play us out if people want to hear it, or they can just pause and go listen to Manifesto by the City Harmonic if they want that context.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it's funny. So W.O. David Taylor, I don't know how I forget, is a academic who writes about this sort of thing. Apparently even cited Manifesto in some academic book of his as being polyphonic and complex. So I was like, cool. All right, I'll take it. That's great.
Yeah. I mean, like your Wikipedia page for that band says, there's like a little bit of Keane and Coldplay and Arcade Fire in there.
Yeah.
And I would say that tracks. So if that sounds good to you, listener, and you'd like to hear a Canadian Christian band doing those bands from the mid 2010s, go check it out.
Exactly.
If that sounds good, I highly recommend it.
If that's your flavor.
If that's your flavor, probably plenty of listeners it is.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of start there. So you're Canadian, and there's going to be differences between your experience as a Canadian Christian versus an American Christian in sort of contemporary Christian culture. We'll get to that. But so in Canada, you guys started as a worship band for a church. Then you started that kind of touring rock band, or
we didn't even start as a worship team for a church. So I had left a staff position at a church where I had helped to sort of start this youth local social missions movement. So we were this was right as over in the UK, you had things like Soul Survivor, I think it was Manchester happening, and these kind of big, like, how is it that we're talking so much about worship music and ignoring like Amos 5? So you have this sense.
Will you remind us, because my audience, me, is not super biblically literate.
No,
What's
that's
Amos
okay.
5
It's kind of the idea of away with the noise of your songs, but let justice roll. And
there's a great John Foreman solo track where he uses that. Yeah.
So we were digging into that way back in the early 2000s, and so we started this thing, which in our hometown of Hamilton, which is like Canada's New Jersey, kind of. We're right close to Toronto. Red brick, tons of old buildings. Like a lot of movies will shoot Brooklyn scenes here.
Oh, Canada's Jersey / Brooklyn. Love it.
It's kind of the vibe. So there's a lot of poverty here for, it's an old industrial town and old architecture and all that. And especially now, but back in the day, the steel mills had shut down, mostly leaving like 100,000 guys with high school, degrees unemployed. So
kind of similar to like the Rust Belt in the U.S. If you know U.S. politics,
like an urban Rust Belt.
Okay,
like a very very urban Rust Belt. Yeah. So lots of challenges, right? And so a bunch of churches started working together and saying, hey, let's pray together, but more importantly, let's do stuff together. And then they found that unity wasn't so hard if instead of centering on, say, a very broad and robust list of beliefs they agreed on. They centered on a pretty narrow and broad list of beliefs that we agree on, Christocentric creedal beliefs, let's say.
Yeah.
And then go, and now what do we do? And so then they would say, well, we need to do something about poverty and affordable housing and the food crisis in our area. And so then they started to do that, and all these cool initiatives started popping up. And so that's what we were doing. We were kind of the house band from different churches for the youth arm of that, where kids would come together in the morning, and then we would sing a little kumbaya, and then they'd go out into the city and, to like 60 or 70 different sites around the city with nonprofits and municipal programs. And they'd be like packing clothes for a food bank or clothing bank, or they'd be picking up syringes in the skate park. And then we'd come back together at the night, and we'd have this big storytelling worship night that was kind of rock and roll. And that's where the City Harmonic came out of.
Honestly, that sounds pretty rad. I mean,
yeah, it was pretty cool.
The word missional would have been right, kind of the word.
This was right as the emergent church was the whole shtick.
Okay,
and we were right in that lane, like no questions asked. That's kind of the lane that we were. So I often joke that we were like one of the early deconstruction bands, but because we were still sort of seeing ourselves as faithful Christians, no one knew how to think about that.
Huh?
Like we weren't off the farm. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Where would you identify that deconstruction thread earlier on in the band's life?
Well, by the time anyone had heard of our band, we had all been through seminary reading and everything else. We were a bunch of nerds, frankly. So even just if you just want to tug on the thread of like Platonic dualism and how that impacts all the rest of it, we were that ship had sailed.
Yeah.
Before anyone knew who we were.
Dualism being the idea of body and soul, being two different
dualism.
substances,
yeah,
which underpins a lot of classical,
a lot of
theology.
Evangelicalism,
and Catholic theology,
some of it, and although there's certainly a pushback in the Catholic world, and then in the Orthodox world, it would be a very confusing conversation altogether. So
they're like, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah, so we were an ecumenical band.
Yeah.
And so we kind of took that seriously. We were actually commissioned by the True City movement, which by its peak was like 30 odd churches working together missionally. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of worship and mission being connected were part of our DNA. That's what the name meant.
It's really interesting. You mean the City Harmonic? That's what that. Yeah. That's a really interesting background, because one of the things I want to do today is kind of get into the research around contemporary worship music. I'm going to be pulling from a couple of researchers, and you are also involved in a little research group with 4 other colleagues called Worship Leader Research. Mm-hmm. But I like that as a background, because I think when most people in my circles, and I would assume this is most listeners, but certainly my friends, when we think about contemporary worship music, the almost the last thing, well, not the last thing I think of would be like missional, poverty addressing sort of movements. I think of private piety in a group setting at a particular church that brings a lot of benefit to people's lives. I know that as a therapist, I know that from the research, but that also is associated with tribalism and in-group, out-group thinking. And so that's it's cool that you didn't come from like a local megachurch context, but came from a ecumenical, across denominational lines, missional context. Because I do think that worship music has a power to help things like that. And maybe it's exactly the thing that's working in just individual churches as well.
Oh, I definitely think so. I mean, so I've, jokingly called myself Anglicostal for a long time, kind of to try to capture some of that for people's imaginations.
Yeah.
But I mean, the other thing that's part of it is I had been running a marketing agency before the band was even formed. And so I was deep into buyer psychology. I was deep into, by that point, Daniel Levitin and his neuroscience work on music and the impact on the brain, and have kept up on almost all of that. So I'm by no means a scientist, but when you work in the marketing consulting space, you have to be at least a hobby scientist.
Right.
And so that's
up on the research.
Yeah, up on the research. And so that's kind of been my lane the whole time. And the truth is a lot of the worship world don't know what to do with that because there's a lot of those gaps. And so, yeah, I get it. I mean, it's funny to like, I would say like looking at worship leader research, for example, the things that we're looking at aren't out to like get anybody. It's not like we need some guy who has the best of intentions to like not have a job tomorrow. But to me, I think like everyone is better off if we can tell the truth about how this works, why people use it. And if we all get more comfortable with that, particularly the local worship leader, who I'm probably more concerned about than I am the like infrastructure that makes these things happen. I think, the local guy underestimates the power that he has in a very big way. And we can talk about that if you want, but yeah.
I do want to. I do want to. I want to kind of connect this because this is not a topic that I've ever really talked about on this podcast before.
Sure,
so I want to kind of tie it into a couple things. First of all, the kind of joke and hook for this podcast is that I recognize that contemporary worship music matters, but I'm not the audience for it. I don't listen to it at all. I actually I was going to kind of make a bigger thing of this, a little game, but I looked up like the 25 most popular worship songs of the 2000s.
Yeah.
And there were like 3 or 4 big ones from the early 2000s, like the rewrites of Amazing Grace. And
sure,
I knew some of those songs because I was involved in a Campus Crusade for Christ group up till about 2003 or so. So I kind of knew a couple of those, but other than that, I only knew one of like the other 20 songs.
Yeah.
And I didn't know it by name. I had to click it to go, I've heard that somewhere.
Yeah.
This is not my world. I don't like it or listen to it. I am convinced by the research and I'm convinced by conversations with therapy clients for whom this is a part of their life.
Yeah,
that this stuff can matter. And you are actually far more up on this research than I am, which is great. That's a relief. I kind of brushed up a little here and there, but where I will connect it to stuff that I do talk about more regularly here, my friend, the theologian Sarah Lane Ritchie, she likes to be called a philosopher sometimes, whatever she wants to call herself. I don't care.
The things she does.
The things she does. She talks about this phrase, spiritual technologies. And this comes up fairly regularly in conversation here. And what's funny is the kind of lead in to that conversation is psychedelic drugs, which are a spiritual technology if they are used in pursuit of some spiritual or religious goal. But we also have always talked about, so is worship music, so is lighting, so is the sound equipment being used.
We're pretty quick to criticize the aesthetic.
Well, yeah, but it's used. It is a spiritual technology. It can be used poorly. It can be used effectively. I mean, and liturgy, the repeating of words over and over again, or even as I have been recently realizing for myself, my caffeine intake is a spiritual technology. And I actually try and have it at the beginning of a service or beginning of a prayer time or something like that because it helps me focus. Like it's a stimulant that wakes me up and makes things feel a bit more profound and more I don't know, impactful. And we can choose. We can we can be intentional about this stuff and recognize the mechanisms. And that's a little bit of what I was getting from you there when you said, I'm concerned about the local worship leader who sort of doesn't know his or her own power.
Oh yeah, because
that's
the thing for me is like my whole shtick, and I'm working on a manuscript that might never. Who knows? You know how that works.
Yes.
So but I have been playing with this idea of like at the end of the worship for humans, man. Like at the end of the day, the thing that we do as embodied human beings, which God does not regret.
Yeah.
So I
like that.
Then that means that our brains, our hearts, our souls, our physiology, our neurology are all coming to the foreground as we engage the question of what it means to worship. And so, for example, one of the questions I'm asked all the time, I've been doing this dumb web series called Say It Dumber, where people who realize all of the various facets of professional work that I'm in will throw me weird questions and I'll answer them.
Yeah,
right?
I enjoyed that on your Instagram.
Oh, thanks.
page.
Yeah,
I did briefly want to say it's too bad you weren't a drummer.
Yes, I know, right? It'd be so much easier.
The dumber drummer.
Yeah, exactly.
Drumming dumber, or
Exactly.
the Instagram handles write themselves.
Oh, totally. Well, and the thing is, like, I think that there's a lot of really easy criticisms to make, as I think that's what you're alluding to.
Yeah.
It's a lot of really criticisms that seem easy, but under examination fall apart pretty quickly. And one of the most common, for example, is worship music emotionally manipulative? Or rather,
Yes.
I would say, is it uniquely emotionally manipulative?
I love that phrasing.
To which my answer is like, hell no.
No,
And also,
it's not.
hell yes. And like, yes,
It
it is.
manipulative, but not uniquely so.
You're not uniquely. Exactly. It is emotionally manipulative because that is what we want music to be.
Mm-hmm.
That is why we go to music in every friggin' setting in the universe.
Mm-hmm.
We go to music to manipulate ourselves. And so, or to shape some mindset, we use it as a spiritual tool, as you're talking about.
I do think that there are groups of people that are more cynical or skeptical or concerned about that. And that to some degree explains the lack of more flamboyant, more evocative music in a lot of mainline settings.
Totally.
Because
yes.
we're worried about the power of this thing, which is sort of what you're saying too. Like, let's just acknowledge the power and teach people about it and have them use it well.
So to me, it's Penn and Teller, right? I have two choices. I can either be a Chris Angel and pretend that I'm magic,
right,
or I can say, no, these are tactics. And because God has always worked through time, place, and people in specific times and places in specific ways through flesh and blood, I mean, heck, the incarnation for Pete's sake, because God has always worked this way through the whole of Scripture, we can have some confidence that just because we can measure it doesn't mean God can't use it. And so the difference is, to me, it's not a problem of the nature of the tools, because the tools are inevitable. It's and the nature of attribution. So we have this almost like borrowed authority thing happening in the worship leader and pastor space, particularly in charismatic circles, of which I'm like loosely connected to, right? You have this sense in which like, well, okay, so we're experiencing collective effervescence. Frisson is some part of that. It produces insane amounts of dopamine and most importantly, oxytocin. And so you have this sense of this embodiment of Matthew 22 happening every time we sing together. So if we say, oh, those goosebumps you're feeling, well, those are God now, and then you experience goosebumps elsewhere, well, of course you're in a weird headspace.
Right.
Whereas like if we just say, no, God is where you see that thing you're feeling, it's incredible. God has designed you in this way and can use that. You might experience that elsewhere. That's totally cool. But God is working. Isn't it beautiful that we get to enjoy this way? It's a totally different framing of the exact same experience. Takes all the gas out of the bag.
It's directly related to my own research, which is not a ton. I developed a scale for measuring spiritual abuse.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Yeah.
And the analogy I always use when I'm talking about this for the power of religion and spirituality is nuclear fission. So spirituality and religion, which is essentially codified spirituality, right? That's a simplistic version, but for the purposes of our conversation, it gets at this part of us that is so core that relates to essentially our deepest feelings, our deepest values, generally the people that kind of engage with the deepest parts of ourselves. So our deepest connection to other people as well. Religion and spirituality work with that stuff. And it is like nuclear fission in that nuclear fission, when done safely and cleanly, produces the cheapest and best and cleanest energy that we know in the modern world.
Right.
And when stuff breaks down, it produces nuclear fallout and destroys everything in a 30-mile radius.
Yep. Right.
And so that's similar to what I'm hearing you say. It's like, this is powerful. Let's acknowledge it. Let's have, safety around it and education. I think that where some people get hurt and worried is that if you have a bad actor, let's say a narcissistic pastor.
Of course they're going to be. And I've experienced that myself.
They are like, all right, worship band, you guys are my double barrel shotgun, and I'm going to pull you out at times when I think I need that. And if he's a bad actor, it's going to hurt people,
Yeah. 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 I mean, that's absolutely the case. That's absolutely true. And that's why I say, like, if we can talk about it differently, the upside for the worship leader is that the senior pastor doesn't really have his eye on this conversation.
Yeah.
So if we can talk about this in healthy ways, we're protecting a lot of people from a lot of hurt. And one of the biggest dilemmas with that, of course, is that it begins with a theological mistake. So there's that dualism, holism problem that is kind of behind a lot of this. And so you kind of have to go there first. You have to address.
Let's talk theology. Let me hear you out. What do you mean?
Well, I mean, you have to address the question of substance dualism, and you have to address the assumption of individualism.
Okay,
right?
so we kind of already talked a little bit about. Let me anticipate what you mean there, and
yeah,
maybe we can move past it quickly. So I assume what you mean with the dualism thing is, it's not that you're just a guy in a body with this other soul, and when you play worship music, people's bodies aren't affected. It's their souls that are affected, and you can just sort of ignore their bodies. You're like, that's silly.
That's silly.
Engage with the whole person.
Non-biblical.
Yeah,
yes.
It's not biblical. It's not scientifically accurate.
No,
it's just not
it gives
accurate.
worship leaders all kinds of existential crises about ideas like performance and all these other things that are just hogwash for the most part.
Okay, that's interesting. Say more about that.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this as a therapist. But like you read up on the idea of, say, authenticity and, the research on that. And so there's this sense in which, like, worship leaders usually, when they're getting concerned about the idea of performing in the moment, what they're talking about is some version of like personality consistency or that sort of thing, as opposed to understanding their authenticity and their expression of authenticity as living a life coherent with values.
Right. So if I turn that into a non-worship musician, for instance, I might feel, because I spent many years touring in my old band, and there are nights when you want to play and there's nights when you don't want to play.
Yes.
And if you have a real, and I've known guys like this, guys and gals like this, who have a very strong need for a certain kind of authenticity where it's like, I'm only going to play what I feel like playing each night. And if I deviate from that to make the crowd happy, I'm being inauthentic.
Yes, right.
But another performer might have a different mindset about that. And they might say, you know what? Actually, we did a lot of work to craft a set of songs, and we play these 12 songs. We feel really strongly about it. Yep. And whether or not I'm feeling it, it is actually the authentic thing for me to do to get through that set for the sake of my fans.
Exactly. And so on.
They came to pay for a show, and they're not actually here. I think that both of those are legitimate ways of understanding authenticity.
I do agree, but I think the dilemma is you have this sense of like the research on personality consistency and an obsession with personality. I have to find the actual study, to be honest with you.
That's fine. Just tell us kind of what you remember of it.
So basically what I recall is that there's this sort of popular understanding of authenticity as the expression of the internal state.
In the moment.
Right. In the moment.
Yeah.
And then there's the idea of authenticity as a life lived in accordance with values. And its correlation to mental health was very one-sided. A life lived in accordance with with your values is far more likely to produce a happy, satisfied, healthy person than a person who attempts some version of personality consistency, because it's impossible. I don't want to be the same person at work that I am with my wife. Right. That would be inappropriate. It would require me to be some kind of mad narcissist for me to insist on a kind of personality consistency that would bridge across those contexts.
Interesting. Yeah. I think what's difficult in the arts world about that is how
many of us are narcissists? No, sorry.
Well, there's that. Sure. Artists, lead pastors, whatever. But it's also that so much of the best art comes precisely out of that, other idea of authenticity, of like just expression of, raw pain, feeling, whatever. And then great artists will then hone that and sort of finish it later with their craft tools.
Yeah.
But we do kind of associate great art and great artistic expression with this sort of moment to moment authenticity, as opposed to the overall life goals authenticity.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I was just walking through Picasso is sort of a good, so you might not know, I own an art gallery. I live in the art world a lot of the time. So like one
I
of the
don't know
things
that, and I don't live in that world.
yeah. So like I look at, say I'm walking through MoMA about a month ago in New York, and there's this whole display of Picasso's work around his wife, right? Mm-hmm. And there's like 27 sketches and preparations of the same piece.
Yeah.
So there isn't a single great artist who and it's funny, I was, just having a back and forth on social media, as I often do with a pretty popular, fairly perceived as fairly artistic songwriter who I really respect, but he always kind of goes on this talk, sort of like Rick Rubin does, about the idea of like art can't have an agenda, essentially, right? And I'm like, that can't work, because art has to have an agenda. Like there's always a mission, a message, or something, even if it's secondhand, is always present. And so what you don't want to be in is a scenario where we only believe great art happens only by accident.
Oh, totally. I think you could talk about Picasso, but keeping it musical, let's talk about Bruce Springsteen.
Right, yeah.
He might be the pinnacle of this second kind of authenticity we're talking about. And I'll give two examples. From the beginning, when he was working on Born to Run and other of his early records, he's talked at length about this, and he wrote about it in his autobiography. Some of those songs have 27 pages of possible verses, lyrics.
I've been there. I did
writing and writing and writing and writing. And then you only get 4 verses of Born to, like that gets narrowed down to the absolute cream of the crop. And we wonder how a song can be so punchy and say so much with so little. Well, he worked on it forever. And then if you think about, now I think he's more known for the live act of him and the E Street Band. And I saw them a couple years ago in Seattle. And, he's in his late 60s. And for him, if he were to make every arena show night after night that employs literally 100 craftspeople at every stage of whatever, and 3 semi-trucks, if he were to go, you know what, guys, we're just going to do whatever I feel authentic about in the moment, it would just fuck the whole thing up.
Yeah,
I mean, like,
no, he'd be toast.
No, they play the same stuff. I mean, they might move some songs around, and I'm sure there's a little bit of that, but mostly that stuff has to be prepared ahead of time.
Yes.
Because like there's a guy who's in charge of flames.
Totally.
And the flames have to go off at the right time.
And this is kind of what I was saying about like both the dualism thing and the individualism thing, right? Like artists will often struggle, particularly since the 1960s, and earlier in the academy, of course, but popularly since the 1960s or so, right? We've really struggled with the tension between the artist and the audience, the creation of art and their relationship to the audience. So Rick Rubin's now going around talking about the audience comes last and this kind of thing, right? But the problem is that, like, I mean, forgive me for being a marketer, of course, but you've got this like Seth Godin thing going around, which basically describes most sociology, which is people like us do things like this. There's a sense in which we, even in the biblical model, we don't worship Jesus a mono-God. We worship a Trinitarian God. And so there's this sense in which like God, the persons and person, exist in relationship, communal relationship. You cannot divorce the individual from its community. It's insane to try to do so. There's even a schmancy way of, there's imago Dei. People talk about the idea that you're an image bearer of God, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's explorations of this that talk about it as imago Trinitatis. Like if you're an image bearer of God, you are an image bearer of Trinity, which means that even if you are a person, you are inevitably a person in a social matrix. And so there's no sense in which like you can say, I am me despite all of the things that made me. You exist in a give and take with a social strata, period. Yeah. Right.
I mean, I'm less convinced by the Trinitarian arguments because I have just like so little confidence in any particular theological claims
totally
like that.
Fine.
But I am convinced by the other stuff, and I think it's a cool poetic image. I would say like, yeah, I'm not like dropping news here, listeners. I'm not saying I'm non-Trinitarian or anything like that. I honestly have no idea. But what I'll say a bit more from a pragmatic perspective is, all the instances in the Gospels of Jesus sort of communicating with the Father. Yeah. Right. Or whatever that kind of two-way street thing looks like. That is fundamentally human. That's fundamentally like, humanus religiosus or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, totally.
Religious humanity tends to have something like that going on.
Yeah, totally.
And so I'm comfortable there.
And even if you want to take it to an almost crass place and look at it just from commerce, I guarantee you, and this is part of what informed some of the question framing and worship leader research, I guarantee you that people behave in tribal ways.
Yeah, dude. I mean, that's... Yes.
So there's a big difference between what a person predicts they will do in a given scenario and what they will do. And most often, Seth Godin's right. People like us do things like this. If you can gather a sense of the group to which a person believes they belong, and then you can ascertain what they think that group is like, you can accurately predict an awful lot of their actual behavior, even if that flies completely in the face of their self-described intentions.
Oh, okay. This is good. Let's drill down here a little bit. So this is basically why...
This is marketer talk. I'm so sorry.
Well, but it's psychology. And it's the reason it is related to the reason that I pivoted from theology to psychology.
Yeah.
And that is, the idea that the kind of things that we claim,
yes,
for instance, theologically, but other claims we make or self-identities, whatever, that is not, if you want to understand why someone did something, looking to the explanation that they give is usually not as good.
Yeah, it's like survey data.
As
it
looking
tells
to
you
some other
bit
more objective thing,
Yeah.
So, like even with clients who are, wondering why a loved one did something or trying to understand it.
Yeah.
They might start with, well, they said this, or they always say this. But then I might nudge them with a different kind of a question of like, what do you think it did for your mom that she did that?
Oh,
What need was it addressing? Whether or not your mom's aware of that need, but what do you think it did for her? And then that sends people maybe down a different road, and then they're looking through different ways. And so, yeah, I mean, that group identity thing, I mean, that's also the concern, right? Around
it is because you've got group identity and emotion are the two biggest factors in choice making, right? I mean, you're probably familiar with the research on head trauma victims where, Jonathan Haidt quotes this stuff a lot, but and there's many others like it, not just Jonathan Haidt. Yeah. Just in case.
Well, you don't know this, but Righteous Mind was the book that kind of in part convinced me to pursue psychology.
Yeah, well, that's part of what I'm talking about here is at the end of the day, when emotion is divorced from choice making dies. So there's a sense in which like we have to have emotional information.
Yes, I am familiar with this research,
choices.
and I talk about it with clients, especially clients who were raised evangelical and raised to believe that their emotions are bad and their reason is good.
Yes.
And I'll bring up this research because it's not popularly and widely known, but there are people with brain injuries such that their emotional centers of their brain, I'm sure that's
it's oversimplified, but
are disconnected from their rational decision-making centers or significantly more so than the average person. And those people actually make irrational choices.
No choices at all.
And so there's actually, we need both, and they have to be in a tension and communication with each other. And people find that freeing,
I do. Some people
too.
find it spooky, but I'm like, no, I'm a human being in a body and that's okay. Yeah. So that's when I talk about the theology of like, individualism and dualism, that's basically what I'm saying is like, if we don't challenge those assumptions that essentially the value of the self arises in the self itself, instead of like, I have a relationship to my community and my community has a relationship to me and I exist somewhat as a product of that community. And it would be silly for me to assume that can't be true in some way.
Yeah.
Right. And so that is an operating assumption in terms of its relationship to authenticity and self-expression and all of that. And that feeds into worship in a big way. And then the other one is that substance dualism, that my body can't be trusted in this magical sense, which happens to lie to itself an awful lot, can be trusted.
Yeah. How do you deal with the concern, or I wonder if people give this pushback, that a worship experience is one of the only enchanted places we have left in modern society, and now here you guys are disenchanting it?
Well, and I would say this isn't even worship leader researchers' work in its sense. Worship leader research was specifically looking at the relationship between the industry and the local church. So it's looking more at the like structural in commercial questions. A lot of the work around psychology and science has been just my lifelong project. And so, yeah, but at the end of the day, yeah, it's fair. I just think we're at a point where trust in the church is fairly at an all-time low among many, many people.
Yeah.
And part of the reason for that is this attribution crisis I talk about. I think at the end of the day, we're looking at something which we can measure and can explain. And instead of coming into an explanation that allows us to like square that away in a healthy way, we're doubling down on the sort of myths that have built around those experiences. And so I don't say myths as in to say God can't be in them. Again, with my sort of theological presumptions, I say myths as in we have convenient stories that enable abuse instead of doing the exact same things with very different framing. Takes a lot of the opportunity for abuse out of there. And so to me, that just seems like a healthy need. Like if it's not emotional manipulation. If people come to church and we say, what a beautiful thing that this is, God is surely working through it, all this sort of stuff. It's a thing when it says, I, worship leader, am delivering God to you, therefore I'm more important than you.
Yeah.
That's where it gets weird. And that's where a lot of the assumptions lie.
Won't a worship leader or a pastor who says, I am the special person bringing God to you, always be more popular than the pastor or worship leader who says, here, take a peek behind the curtain. This is how this works. There's nothing magic about me. There's nothing specially anointed about me. Like,
right.
That's true.
Yep.
And
that's probably why I'm not more popular.
Less effective, right? That's why I'm not more popular.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong at all. I think there's some truth to that. I do think in the internet age, especially as demographics age up, you know, like we got Gen Z coming up now and millennials are reasonably internet educated.
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which like most of us grasp that information is easy to get.
Yeah. And I do wonder if that, I do wonder with Gen Z, especially being fully digitally native, if they will act differently to claims of authority than, for instance, Gen Xers and Boomers do.
Right.
Who couldn't fact check things. I mean, I think about even, you know, I'm 40, and when I was growing up in evangelicalism, in a moderate California version of evangelicalism, no fundamentalism in my family or church, some fundamentalists in my schooling, but like I had it pretty easy compared to a lot of listeners. But even in that world, it was like how, like the thing that I work on with clients these days is a lot of cognitive therapy, and we are constantly asking the question, what is the evidence for and against this thought I'm having or this idea that I've been told? And if I wanted to even ask that question in 1996 at my school assembly for the guy who came through and spouted whatever he spouted that week, where the hell would I even check that?
Right.
Like, how would I look for that evidence? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
And I do wonder, like, you know, put that on Gen X or Boomers, that's even more, you know, around high school, I started to learn how to check things online or whatever. So that does feel like a sea change, and I wonder what that will do. But there's also, I don't know, 15,000 years of somewhat recorded human history, and maybe
I mean, just watch Dune if you need to. Right. You know, I mean, like it's not that complicated to see that the brain is lazy. And we love simple stories.
Yeah, well, we're trying to preserve energy, you know?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, glucose is hard, man.
Yeah.
So like it's you know, we're out there doing this stuff, and I just think more self-awareness is good. I think myth busting is God's work. And so for me, I will admit I have put myself in a position where this is possible to do. My income only sort of comes from Christian music. I own 6 companies. Most of what I spend my time doing is helping people connect with audiences and buy art. Yeah. And so like and, you know, working with artists and coaching and that sort of thing and consulting strategy, I sell flowers and art and, you know, hockey bags and whatever else. It's like, this is sort of the thing that I'm doing. And I try to do that in an honest and faithful way. And that allows me to engage the questions of ministry, the ideas of ministry, church itself, Christian music, all of that from a not safe place, but from a place that's like, I'm just going to do the true thing that I think is true and move on with my life. And so, there are people who are more popular than me, certainly. But I feel pretty free to be myself, and I enjoy that quite a bit.
I resonate with that too. And the podcast is supported by listeners, and I see clients and earn money that way, and have a little residual income from the composition days. And I recognize that, actually. I recognize that pretty often, how much freedom that gives me to pursue whatever seems true based on evidence to me. And I'm not beholden to any sort of board of elders or faith statement. Thank the Lord. One of the things that, back to the power of worship music, or the potential power, there's one church in Seattle doing something. I believe there are more in South Seattle, like 45 minutes or farther from my house, but there's one church I've been to in the city limits called Quest Church. And it is the one time that I went there visiting with a buddy who goes there, the band was very clearly, intentionally multicultural. They had a big band. They had instrumentalists that would help it be kind of multi-genre. So there was a hand percussionist, and there was some brass, and there was, a cadre of background singers. And some of the songs they would do like a Spanish chorus in the middle. And this church is very specifically multicultural. That is sort of their reason for being, I'm sure, among other things. And it was really powerful. And it made me think, wow, it's so cool that this is possible, even in a city like Seattle, which is super white, just compared to other urban centers. And I'm sure Canada. You have
I feel like
problems.
in Seattle, that would take a lot of work.
It surely does. And I'm sure it does take a lot of work for them. If we're kind of thinking of, some of the research talks about, and I'm pulling from Monique Ingalls from Baylor, who you mentioned earlier. You know her personally, and a little bit from Dr. Courtney Tepera from the College of Charleston. I don't know anything about her, but I found some of her stuff online, some peer-reviewed stuff. And, there is, you talked about collective effervescence earlier, this idea of, we experience this at rock concerts and at protests and anywhere that people get together and sport events, right? So we're sort of subsuming ourselves to the collective whole, and it kind of lifts everybody in a quantifiable way, but also qualitatively just in a very enjoyable and energizing kind of a way.
Humans seem to really like this thing.
Yes, exactly. And we do. Yeah. And so there's sometimes music can unite us across these various divisions of ethnicity or culture, stuff like that. And it strikes me that contemporary praise music, because it is actually enjoyed by a wide variety of people, even though I'm not one of them, it's a big group of people across all kinds of lines.
Yeah.
Where do we see evidence of it doing that? Is that a nice thing in theory, or do you feel like, no, I've seen this with my own eyes of it helping to unite people?
I think it is doing that in some way. I mean, if you look even just at the relationship between the growth of, say, Pentecostal and Charismatic church in the second and third world, and the kind of songs that they're singing in that process, it is by and large. Now, this is tricky because it's hard to separate from colonialism and all kinds of other stuff.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it is simple enough to say, well, it does seem to be something that's connecting people. And I think partly the same thing that makes it hard, the dance of complexity versus musical simplicity and ease of access for people who are non-singers and all of that. I think it's fair to say that like non-first world cultures probably are more musical cultures in terms of like in the first world, we tend to specialize music as a practice. And so it actually could even arguably translate better than in contexts where things like syncopation and other things are more comfortable to the average person.
Where people know to clap on the 2 and the 4.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. And so I think there's, I mean, I don't have like a research project to point to, but we did, for example, one of the big critiques, not of our work, but a question that came up often early on was just that like, well, here we are reporting on CCLI and praise charts and between this 10-year period between 2010 and 2020 and looking at trends there, one of them being that, 100% bar one song of the top 25 CCLI songs introduced in that time came from or were popularized by just 4 megachurches, right?
Hillsong, Elevate, Bethel.
Yeah, Hillsong, Elevation, Bethel, and Passion.
Okay.
So, and then the North Point had a song, and then Phil Wickham had one song, which was like the 3rd single he had released in that period, and the first 2 had both been popularized by Bethel. So it's sort of like hard to separate that, but technically the one Phil Wickham song is the exception. So it's a tricky thing in that, like,
tech of corporate worship.
Definitely. But I actually don't blame the churches. That's the funny part. Like we had a conversation on a podcast that loves to gotcha all Christian stuff. It's a very popular podcast. I won't name it. And the entire conversation was essentially...
I wish you would. That's okay.
The entire conversation was essentially trying to paint us into a corner of saying there's a cabal of worship people trying to rule the world.
No.
And
I've met these songwriters. There's no cabal.
There's no cabal.
They just don't want a day job, man. They're just trying to...
But the average worship leader is overworked. The average worship leader does have some of these ideas that probably over-rationalize choices and therefore diminish the role of brand trust and other things that every other company in the world would take for granted. But in the Christian space, we sort of get a pass, you know? And so some of what we've been looking at is more of that. Like, for example, the relationship. And I mean, I see this if I look at my own Spotify data. I've never been to Brazil. I don't have a single song in Portuguese. And yet for myself and for every other CCM artist I know, and worship artists especially, Brazil is our number 3 market in the world.
Wow.
So in terms of like, is it translating? Yeah, I think because English, again, is that complicated? Sure it is.
Yes.
But nevertheless, because English language is so universally understood among certain educated groups around the world, it translates more than you'd think. The thing I would say is that there is a bit of an infrastructure problem there too. You got things like Spotify, Apple Music, which are global companies, right? So these are, particularly Spotify, is attempting to service music around the world, right? That's why if you look at the Spotify top 50, you'll see Bad Bunny and all these people that, you know, your average white millennial's like, I don't even know who that is, you know?
Yeah.
And he's like the number 1 artist in the world, right? So you see that playing out. Well, we also started to see a relationship between how Spotify would make changes and which songs and the kinds of songs and the nature of the songs that would come to the forefront of what's popular in the church. And so, like, it's basically impossible to talk about worship and talk without talking about the infrastructure that makes that possible. And that was always true. It was true of hymnody. And 2017 was this line where before 2017, it was roughly 50-50 in terms of songs which were singles and songs which were deep cuts that would arrive in the top 50 CCLI songs or whatever it is, right? 2017, Spotify makes an active intentional change to the way that they distribute songs. And from 2017 and onwards, 100% of the top 25 CCLI songs were released as singles. Which means they were selected.
By the way, is the official way you register and get paid for congregational songs.
That's right. Yeah, it's the royalty body for worship music. And so 100% of songs after 2017, when Spotify did this on purpose, were as singles, which means they were pre-selected by a team set up to be such and so on. So you get this sense in which, like, you can't separate some of the commercial reality of worship music globally, locally, from the infrastructures and tools that make it possible to have.
Okay, but the way that sounds to someone like a cabal is, well, who chooses the singles? And that's true. So for any album of 10 tracks that any particular artist puts out on a Christian record label, they might only have, let's say, 3 shots at a big worship hit. However, if you take all of those singles, there's still a lot of artists. So it's like the audience is still choosing
to a degree
the songs that they like, and
I think
listen to those more. And you know, it's not like not like Sparrow Records can just pay to have an artist have a number 1 worship song.
I mean, they can certainly try, and they do try. But yeah, on every Friday, the programmers at Spotify and Apple receive something like 1,000 songs that they then have to whittle down to less than 40 for New Music Friday, which is the big playlist that's basically a predictor of whether or not your song's going to exist on the DSPs, which is a short form for Spotify, Apple, and DSPs.
The digital service providers.
That's right. So yeah, I mean,
look at me and my acronym game is strong today.
You're killing it here.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I actually don't remember what CCLI stands for though.
Church something contemporary Christian licensing international or something
Flattening
like that.
out the playing field.
Yeah, we're good. Yeah. But one of the criticisms that we received when this data started to come out was that, well, wait, these are largely white churches. These are largely contemporary evangelical churches. What about, say, for example, the Black church in America, right? And so we can't fix that problem, but the reality is that data doesn't exist.
Like no one tracks what the Black churches are playing?
Not really,
kidding me?
No.
So Kirk Franklin could be over here getting 3-4 times as much income as he's getting.
Now it's tricky because depending on who you ask, it can have a very nuanced relationship to why that is.
Okay.
But a lot of churches just don't participate in bodies which make that possible.
Right.
Some of that, I was talking actually at a lunch with Monique Ingalls and others at Baylor. They had this new professor who was specifically sort of researched communitarian music and gospel music and all this kind of stuff. And so he was sort of saying, he's like, at the end of the day, for a lot of people, it seems like a misnomer to gospel music to think about it as a royalty creating engine, even though these people are going home and listening to the music because it's in their heart, sort of, it's like music that arises from an experience of community. So how do you then pass that along in the same way that we think of songwriting in the sort of contemporary worship space? So it is a tricky thing. And so like, we don't have the answer to that, of course, but in terms of how this music is universalized, well, it's obviously not perfectly universalized, but it's also just in the same way that Roman roads allowed trade to flourish. There's a sense in which commerce, even broken commerce, is causing things to cross borders and cultures and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's very hard to accurately predict all the positives and unforeseen consequences of these kind of global trends and whatnot.
Yes, right.
Here's the big worry, I think, for me and probably a lot of listeners, is that currently in America, and I can't speak to above the border in Canada, but in the United States, now I would say, it's hard to put a percentage on this, but certainly the majority of the evangelical and contemporary worship adjacent church infrastructure has been, if not fully co-opted by right-wing politics, it is at least so friendly as to never push back on it. Because if a pastor or a worship leader does push back on it, the audience, which has been suckled at the teat of Fox News and Newsmax and basically given fucking baby formula that makes it feel happy for a couple seconds, and then like raging inside and full of anxiety and dread. Because that audience now has been empowered that like, oh, well, so we'll fire you and we'll find somebody who tells us what we want to hear. Obviously they wouldn't say, just like our thing earlier, they wouldn't say that, but that's what would happen. And so great. You and I agree. There is this very powerful spiritual technology of contemporary worship music that can be used toward good ends and can be understood sort of empirically. And who wields most of that power is people who either have been corrupted by this right-wing ideology or are too afraid of it.
Switzerland to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So cool. I mean, so then how do you guys ensure that whatever you're teaching people isn't just like going into the hands of the bad actors?
I mean, and I don't know if it's as simple as that either.
No, it's definitely not. It's certainly not. That's sort of the simple question.
Yes.
And in fact, I'll just say, I know it's not that simple because I've had clients who go to churches that are a part of this infrastructure. And I also see the value in attending for their personal lives. It is obviously a mixed bag, but that's the concern.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I think that's fair. I mean, at the end of the day, it's sort of the same thing. I mean, when I do this like Worship for Humans teaching thing, I do a whole week of lectures. I work starting with theology and individualism and blah, 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 and work through a lot of these questions and end up with like hard performance skills. And so like part of the problem is it's like the Penn and Teller question, right? It's like, I'm going to teach you how to do magic. In other words, like, I'm going to teach you how to manipulate. But the problem is, if you go out there and pretend that that's not what you're doing, but that you are magic, that's on you. Like, that's on you being a bastard.
Yeah.
You know, like, and so like, to some degree, I have two options in my mind. Let the myth persist and say nothing, or talk about being faithful to God in all the ways that I think biblically stand up, and then talk about facts as they are, and do that in an open-handed, generous way, so that what I'm not doing is coming out and being like, I'm going to shoot you all down, because not only do I not think that way, I have too many friends who are sincere people who are part of these things. It's like, at the end of the day, it's like, I just think telling the truth will help us all over time do the thing. And I'm willing to be patient in that, even though, you know, as a Canadian, of course, I've moved home now. I'm back in Canada. You know, I'm not fearing total crisis in the same way that I might have been had I still been living in Nashville. But nevertheless, it's like there's this sense in which, like, I think God, and this gives me some security anyway, I think God is a heck of a lot more patient than we tend to be. Sure. I wish that our churches had lived that way the last 112 years or whatever.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's like God is comfortable to wait 400 years for something to seem official. By any modern commercial standard, the early church was a slow-moving failure.
Yeah. And maybe that is and I am an institutional kind of a guy. It might be the institutionalist in you talking that you would call Constantine declaring Christianity the official religion of Rome, making.
But do you see what I'm saying? But you see my point.
Yes.
Like, I'm not saying that isn't a mixed bag.
God's been waiting 14 billion years. I mean, that's God's
been working through kind of broken things.
If God exists, God
time.
is more patient than we are.
Yes, exactly. And comfortable working with imperfection.
Yeah.
That much is clear.
One more kind of researchy thing. And then I have a little fun thing to close on. So This is from Courtney Tepera's work.
Yeah.
Really cool little bit here. Here's a quote from her. I find that underlying this practice, so she's not just talking about corporate worship, she's also talking about people's individual listening to Christian, like, devotional music.
Yep.
Underlying this practice of devotional listening is the respondent's conception that music was uniquely created by God to be a tool for spiritual engagement. In these congregations, being created to worship means also being created to sing. End quote. And it ties in a cool way with the sort of spiritual technology stuff we've been talking about, but it's also this larger purpose that, like, whatever God had in mind, so to speak, music is a part of that and has this devotional and connective purpose. I think if you are open to the idea of any sort of divine, that's actually pretty uncontroversial, right?
Yeah.
Isn't it Tolkien who in the Silmarillion, literally like, the creator of Middle Earth, like, sings it into existence?
Yeah,
and that's a really powerful metaphor.
And I mean, Daniel Levitin's work, I think it was in The World in Six Songs, the popular book, he was talking about how anthropologically, it seems to him at least, and I'd have to find his actual research on it, but he was sort of arguing that it seems likely that music predates speech in human history. Yeah,
I've talked about this a lot. This is also what Robert Bellah thought, the sociologist of religion, before he passed away, that there is a lot, certainly rhythmic movement, grunting, and singing appear to have been biologically possible before modern speech.
Yes.
There are certain tongue muscle developments that we don't think we had back then. So we had singing before we could talk.
And Levitin's argument is that that's actually part of the relationship between singing and oxytocin. Because if you could sing a familiar melody, you could trust the other party because they knew your melody.
You're in a tribe together. Yes. So that is deep, deep power, man. It's pre-human culture, essentially.
Yep. Yeah. Or, well, I mean, it depends on how you want to define culture.
Whatever you want to define culture. It's at the very beginning.
Yes. At the very beginning, we were probably singing to each other and with each other before we could argue or rationalize discuss in some way. Yeah.
So that's a reason to take it seriously in and of itself right there. There's your reason to take it seriously.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say, like, musically, I'm a guy who has been writing songs that are a little too complicated the whole time by accident. So for all of my efforts and beliefs that simplicity wins, I can't bring myself to do it. So I don't know, what that means. I'm either lyrically a little too far the whole time or musically a little too far all the whole time. But I'm kind of I've made peace with it at this point in my life. But it is sort of this, like, it's a tough thing, especially as a musician, because you want to enjoy the work that you make.
Yeah.
And you want to feel that payoff yourself. Right. But I think the thing that scares me in that conversation is if we villainize the acquisition of skills which help to use this tool, and we villainize the practice of skills which help facilitate this tool, what are we left with but shamans? So
yes.
So I say kill the shaman. We do the thing as shepherds, and we get out there and learn the skills and be humble about it. And don't imagine that we're more important than the dentist. He knows about teeth. I know about the minor six. So what? Like, we move on with our lives and we do this praying thing powerfully together because it's as old as we are.
So to end, and speaking of a practical approach, I have like a pet theory.
Yeah. Okay.
Around the most, possibly the most effective genre of music for a church that is trying once a different non-CCM, CWM musical approach, but is interested in, the stuff we've been talking about, especially the stuff, maybe a little bit less the private devotion and a little bit more the kind of connectivity across lines.
Yep.
Motown soul.
Hey, it feels good.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's especially something with Motown soul in the call and response, give and take relationship.
I hadn't thought of that. I like that. So the things that I'd thought of was it is a sort of pan-continental music rhythmically. So it incorporates the best of African rhythm that came via, obviously, the slave trade. It also was always embraced by white audiences. So it crosses racial lines. It is the music most likely to be heard at weddings that are intercultural and intergenerational, right? You hear shout, you hear whatever. It also has ballads. So it has a form for more slow and like deeper feeling songs. And it's fucking great. It's just good.
Yes.
Musicians like it too.
Yeah.
Now it's harder to play.
Totally
it's
true.
hard to play. You can't. It doesn't scale down to house churches like acoustic music does or whatever.
There's a little bit of an assumption baked into the kinds of songs which are now popular in worship music, which is a bit of a bee in my bonnet, that Motown soul would fail at. Which is, if you look at, say, Leviton's work and you look at his exploration of the Beatles and the payoff. Right. So the payoff would typically happen, 3/4 of the way through the song. There's a sense of a dynamic animated sort of dynamic sense where the dopamine and oxytocin crescendos at the 3/4 mark and onward.
Sort of bridge into the last chorus kind of a thing. Is that sort of the biggest
and so
payoff?
worship music often now starts it's trying to do all of the things every time. So every song is trying to be an epic. Not epic in and of itself, but an epic.
An epic, yeah.
And so the problem is Motown is never an epic.
No.
So Motown is always, this is the thing we are doing now.
Except maybe some of the ballads. Maybe some of the ballads. Yeah.
But for the most part, it's 3 or 4 minutes of a feeling.
Yes.
And then there is another 3 or 4 minutes of a different feeling. And I actually think we could use more of that in worship music than we have. But nevertheless, if we wanted to say that, like, there's something therapeutic in an epic mentality, well, worship music does that uniquely. There's not really another genre that's as committed to the idea of like massive contrasts. And psychologically, I could explore every one of those and explain them away.
Yeah.
But the massive contrasts, this almost cinematic arrangement of dynamics through the course of the song, well, it's worship music and like Sigur-Rós and Coldplay.
Yeah.
It's like there's not very many bands that are that committed to not having a feel through a song. You know?
Yeah.
So all that to say, like, Yeah, I agree with you, except that the model we have right now appears to be specifically designed to produce frisson.
Well, you said frisson twice now.
Goosebumps.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I love Motown, but I can't. I'm like, have I had Motown goosebumps? I was like, maybe not.
Okay.
No, I know. Yeah. I love it. Totally.
Goosebumps, bro. I'm getting them right now. Just humming the Jackson 5.
That's fair. And there's a lot of melodic sense in that and all of that, right?
Or you get the goosebumps by looking over across the aisle and seeing the 75-year-old man has gotten out of his chair.
Yeah.
Because he's got to shake that rump.
Yeah.
So I don't know. There's other ways to get frisson.
That's
Frisson.
right. Yeah. I think there are different words, but I don't know.
Okay,
frisson. Frisson.
I don't use that word. Oh, great.
Yeah.
Learn something every day.
Anyway, I think that's a great theory for sure.
It's not a great theory. It's a pet theory. I think it would work for like an urban church that was trying to be a bit more kind of arty or try something different, you know?
Yeah. And right now they all seem to lean into like folk, Sufjan kind of stuff.
Which it's like, it's been 10 years, guys, 15 years now. And I should say the church that my wife and I have been a part of for most of the last 15 years is in that kind of Bifrost arts, kind of the Vito from the Welkin Wagon,
arts and crafts Sufi, aesthetic.
Yes. And too often great effect. But I don't know. I want like a black rhythm section that I just trust to be in the pocket.
And this my challenge with all of it, with worship music, with the folk scene in the worship space, is like I'm okay with us putting our feet on the dirt. That's not a problem for me. I'm into that. I just don't want to like celebrate mediocrity. Yeah. It's like we can be great at this, so we shouldn't just be like, well, we shouldn't be great at this because that's a problem. It's like, no, we should learn the thing, be humble about it, and be great at it. You know?
I guess it just depends on what your goal is, because I do think there could be a value in being able to scale down to home churches, because
totally.
Home churches 100%. Have, they don't have the antidote to every problem, but they have a lot of the antidote to the narcissistic megachurch culture.
Yeah. Or even just centering communion. Forgive my Anglican from coming out, but
I love that, dude. That's my favorite thing.
Make the climax of the worship service the table, and a lot of ego is necessarily stripped away.
Yeah. And the American religious consumers who have been given their own choices for their whole lives will go, we'll find another church that doesn't do that.
Yeah. I mean, maybe, I don't know. It's certainly popular here. It's a lot of churches do the communion weekly thing now.
I think there's deep wisdom in the liturgical traditions to center it around the Eucharist. I think that it, and by the way, oh my gosh, no offense to John Harrelson, our pastor, and other people who preach at our church. He's going to be an upcoming guest on the show, actually, him and his wife. But John, I prefer the 18-minute homily to your old 45-minute Tim Keller light stuff.
And dude, here's the thing. I love a good sermon, but like the data on retention is real bad.
I don't need to see the data, Elias. I know people are not retaining that shit.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's a tough thing for sure. So like James K.A. Smith talks about this all the time in terms of
his work.
In terms of like, he's probably a bit more of a traditionalist than I am, obviously, I think. But at the end of the day, I think he's right about habit. He's just right. He came at it through like a backdoor philosophy. And I'm going, all the data on learning says the same thing, which is like, which also calls to question sort of what we were talking about in terms of how a spiritual experience works on us and what it is that worship music is doing. So if worship music is principally about enjoyment, well, we'll get more dopamine, we'll get something about that. But even just the repetition of singing together as a practice forms us in the same way that brushing your teeth forms your teeth. Like there's a sense in which it'd be silly to think that toothbrushing only works when you are thinking about each tooth that you are brushing.
No, exactly. And one of the reasons, not the only reason, like evangelicals love to say that the mainline denominations are dying because they've strayed from the biblical truth, which is in my opinion, patently false.
Right.
I do think that it's more likely that we should look at the modes of passing it down and how invested people are and young people are when they go to those services. And one of the things that those churches have by and large rejected is a worship music style that binds people together and increases their dopamine and oxytocin and pulls on 300,000-year-old strings.
Yeah, they've rationalized, most mainlines. I mean, I planted a Methodist church, or co-planted one. So like, I know kind of the culture of that in the main line. And at the end of the day, it's like, there is a lot of like over rationalizing the liturgy, which is missing the point. Like the whole thing, and that's sort of what we were talking about emotion earlier. It's like, at the end of the day, this all comes down to embodiment. It's yes, we need reason, but reason doesn't do the whole work. And yes, we need emotion, but emotion left to its own devices is a bad car driver. So you kind of need this sense in which like we need to approach both from a planning and leadership standpoint, culturally, and from a participant standpoint, the idea and question of worship as a whole human. And if we aren't willing, then we're always going to end up with these idiosyncratic problems.
I agree. And I treat clients with a similar approach. It's the whole person.
Yep.
And we got to know about sleep and nutrition and social connection and
totally.
Exercise and, all those things play in. It's not, we're not going to get this just by talking,
No, you might enjoy this. I saw something on social media not too long ago. They were saying, my mom had the best wisdom in the world. It was, if you think the world hates you, take a nap. If you hate the world, eat a sandwich.
That's good. Yeah.
I was like,
that's great.
There's
good place
there's
to start.
Something to that. It's like, our emotional state is really often linked to a lot of stuff we don't stop to think about. And
it took us 8 years of touring together to realize that most of our arguments happened when one or more of us were hungry.
Yeah.
In our 20s.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, totally.
Well, Elias, this has been a lot of fun, man. Thanks for joining me. We'll have links to your Instagram and website and stuff like that on the show notes so people can catch up with you there. And then we are going to have Manifesto by the City Harmonic will play us out here in all its rich sound quality glory. And yeah, man, just thanks for being here.
Thanks, man. It was a blast.